A semiglue, why nations fail. 7. The turning point.
We must begin, I think, with the very start of textile mechanization. The context was a ruling by Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, that her people should always wear a knitted cap.
That ruling inspired a tremendous moment of thought by William Lee, the local priest in Calverton, England. He returned from his studies at the University of Cambridge around 1583.
He noted that knitters were the only means of producing such garments, but the process took so long. He watched his mother and sisters hand knitting and reasoned that if 2 needles and 1 line of thread made a garment, surely several needles could be used to take up the thread.
That idea was the momentous thought that initiated the mechanization of textile production.
Lee became utterly consumed by the idea of creating a machine to free people from endless hand knitting, neglecting his church and family duties. By 1589, his stocking frame knitting machine was ready.
He traveled to London hoping to show the machine to Queen Elizabeth I and seek a patent to prevent copying. With help arranged by Lord Hunsdon, the Queen came to see it, but her reaction was devastating. She refused to grant him a patent.
Indeed, she observed, "Thou aimest high, Master Lee. Consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring to them ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars."
Lee then failed in France and returned to England, seeking a patent from James I, 1603 to 1625. James I also refused, citing the same fear. Both monarchs feared that the mechanization of stocking production would be politically destabilizing, creating unemployment and instability that threatened royal power.
The reaction to Lee's brilliant invention illustrates a key idea. The primary reason there was no sustained increase in living standards between the Neolithic and Industrial revolutions was the fear of creative destruction.
Technological innovation makes societies prosperous, but it replaces the old with the new, and crucially, it destroys the economic privileges and political power of certain people. Innovators, often newcomers like Lee, introduced new ways of doing things that threaten the livelihood of those working with old technologies, such as the hand knitters who would have been unemployed.
But the political threat was paramount. It was not primarily concern over the unemployed that drove Elizabeth I and James I, but their fear that displacement would cause political instability and threaten their own power, making them political losers.
While resistance from workers, like hand knitters, is often bypassed, the elite, especially when their power is threatened, pose a more formidable barrier. They have much to lose from creative destruction, so they often resist and try to stop such innovations. Prior to the 17th century, extractive institutions, which did not permit creative destruction, were the norm. However, conflict over institutions was pervasive in England.
A critical early outcome occurred in 1215, when the barons challenged King John, forcing him to sign the Magna Carta. This document enacted basic principles that challenged King John's authority, such as the requirement to consult with the barons to raise taxes. The most contentious clause, number 61, gave 25 barons the right to ensure the king implemented the charter, allowing them to seize his possessions if he failed to make amends. Although King John immediately had the Pope annul it, the political power of the barons and the influence of the document persisted, marking a first, hesitant step toward pluralism.
Later, political power began to centralize under the Tudors. Henry VII disarmed the aristocracy, and Henry VIII implemented a revolution in government, introducing a nascent bureaucratic state separate from the king's private household.
This centralization actually helped mobilize demand for pluralism. When barons and local elites recognized that political power was increasingly centralizing and difficult to halt, they demanded that Parliament serve as a counterweight to control how this centralized power was used. Thus, the Tudor project contributed both to political centralization and indirectly to pluralism.
The institutions the Stuarts inherited in 1603 were still extractive. James I and his successor, Charles I, desired absolutist rule and strengthened extractive institutions.
This extraction was most visible in the form of monopolies. By 1621, 700 monopolies existed. These monopolies covered everything from bricks and glass to salt and lobsters, giving sole control over the production of many goods to specific individuals or groups.
The Crown used its ability to grant monopolies as a key source of state revenue and a means of rewarding supporters, but this institution was highly damaging to economic activity and blocked market entry. Parliament achieved a notable victory in 1623 with the Statute of Monopolies, which prohibited James I from creating new domestic monopolies. However, Charles I continued his absolutist efforts, particularly after 1629, by creating and selling monopolies in overseas trading ventures, which the statute had not restricted.
Charles I's absolutist behavior led to the Civil War in 1642. Following the restoration of the monarchy, James II intensified efforts to re-establish absolutism. This crisis led Parliament to invite William of Orange and Mary to replace him in 1688. The resulting constitutional changes were enshrined in the Declaration of Rights, later the Bill of Rights. This document significantly departed from hereditary principles by determining the succession to the throne, asserting that the monarch could not suspend laws, and reiterating the illegality of taxation without parliamentary consent.
Crucially, the authority and decision-making power shifted to Parliament after 1688. Parliament's interests were different from the stewards. Many members had investments in trade and industry and a strong stake in enforcing property rights. The defeat of absolutism and the rise of pluralism were perhaps best reflected in the practice of petitioning. Although England was far from democratic, Parliament listened when people petitioned, demonstrating that a broad segment of society, beyond those who could vote, now had the power to influence the state.
The fate of the overseas monopolies illustrates this. After Chief Justice Holt ruled that the Royal African Company's monopoly on the lucrative African slave trade was unlawful because it was based on royal prerogative, not statute, Parliament had to decide its fate. 135 petitions demanding free access to Atlantic trade flew in from interlopers. They successfully framed their opposition in terms of national interest. Ultimately, the Royal African Company monopoly was abolished in 1698.
After 1688, Parliament made key changes laying the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. Property rights were strengthened, and policies shifted to promote manufacturing. For example, the hearth tax, which burdened manufacturers, was abolished and replaced by a land tax.
Improved security of property rights was central to the transportation revolution. Investment in infrastructure like roads and canals increased massively. Sir Timothy Baldwin's successful defense of his family's right to charge navigation fees on the Salwarp River against an attempted expropriation demonstrated how much more secure property rights were after 1688.
Parliament also aggressively protected domestic textile production against foreign imports. This led to the Calico Acts. Woolen manufacturers successfully lobbied Parliament, resulting in an act in 1701 making it illegal to wear any Asian silks and painted calicos in Great Britain.
The Calico Act of 2021 closed remaining loopholes, making it illegal to wear any printed, painted, stained, or dyed calico in Great Britain.
However, the pluralistic nature of the new political system limited how far entry barriers could go. When the wool industry tried to suppress the growing domestic fustian industry, a mix of linen and cotton, the new manufacturers and burgeoning industrial centers like Manchester opposed them through intense petitioning.
The new interest won. The Manchester Act of 1736 explicitly allowed for the manufacturing and printing of cloth made from linen yarn and cotton wool within Great Britain. This victory demonstrated the limits of entry barriers and paved the way for the cotton manufacturing innovations central to the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution took root in England because of its uniquely inclusive economic institutions, which were established by the inclusive political institutions brought about by the Glorious Revolution. This environment gave men like James Watt the opportunity and incentive to develop their skills and ideas.
Crucially, after 1688, those who suffered from or feared creative destruction were no longer able to stop it. Even Richard Arkwright, who one of the dominant figures of the Industrial Revolution, failed to get courts to enforce a patent he sought in 1775 to monopolize cotton spinning.
The emergence of this pluralistic regime, however, was contingent. It was highly dependent on the emergence of a broad coalition that opposed Stuart absolutism.
That diversity, encompassing the gentry, manufacturers, and Atlantic traders, was key. If the coalition had been narrow, the overthrow of the Stuarts might have simply been a replacement of one narrow set of interests with another, recreating extractive institutions. Because the coalition was broad, it demanded pluralism, fearing that one diverse interest might usurp power at the expense of the rest. This broad coalition underpinned the checks in Parliament, preventing any single group, such as the powerful wool interests, from abusing its power and crushing competitors like the cotton manufacturers.